Hello and welcome to Recovery Stories Have Power. My name is Oliver Books. This is the final episode in our series of video podcasts filmed at Faces and Voices of Recovery's annual Recovery Leadership Summit in Denver, Colorado. On today's episode, I was joined by former Congressman Patrick J. Kennedy. During his time in Congress, Patrick J. Kennedy was the lead author of the landmark Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, Federal Parity Law, which requires insurers to cover treatment for mental health and substance use disorder no more restrictively than treatment for illnesses of the body such as diabetes and cancer. In 2013, he founded the Kennedy Forum, a nonprofit that unites advocates, business leaders, and government agencies to advance evidence-based practices, policies, and programming in mental health and addiction. In 2015, Kennedy co-authored the New York Times Bestseller, A Common Struggle, a personal journey through the past and future of mental illness and addiction, which details a bold plan for the future of mental health care in America. In 2023, the Kennedy Forum launched the Alignment for Progress, a movement to align leaders from across industry and across the aisle to achieve 90, 90, and 90 by 23. That's 90% of all individuals will be screened for mental health and substance use disorder, 90% of those screened will be able to receive evidence-based treatment, and 90% of those receiving treatment will be able to manage their symptoms in recovery. Kennedy's second co-authored book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, is available now. Kennedy is also the founder of Don'tDenyMe.org, an educational campaign that empowers consumers and providers to understand parity rights and connects them to essential appeals, guidance, and resources. Co-founder of One Mind, an organization that pushes for greater global investments in brain research. Co-chair of the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention's Mental Health and Suicide Prevention National Response to COVID-19, National Response, and co-chair of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Behavioral Health Integration Task Force. You can find Mr. Kennedy on social media at PJK4BrainHealth on Twitter. Also, Patrick J. Kennedy on Facebook and LinkedIn, or at Kennedy Forum on Twitter, and the Kennedy Forum on Facebook and LinkedIn. Welcome to Recovery Stories Have Power. Thank you, Congressman Kennedy, for joining us today. If you'd like to tell our audience a little bit about yourself for those who might not know, and where they can find you and what you've been up to.
Sure. I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means for me that I've not had to drink or drug since February 22nd, 2011.
Congratulations.
Thanks to Faces and Voices of Recovery, I know how to talk about my recovery without violating the 11th tradition
Absolutely.
of my 12-step group, which without I would not be here today.
Yeah.
So I was fortunate in Congress to be the sponsor of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which was the law that prohibits insurance companies from discriminating in coverage decisions against people seeking care for their addiction and for their mental illness. Essentially, the law says, for people who want to know how specific, we said inpatient in-network, outpatient in-network, inpatient out-of-network, outpatient out-of-network, pharmacy benefits, and emergency room benefits all must be comparable to what you would expect for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and any other medical condition. And it has to be at the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels, which means just like we do screening for cancer so that we don't have to treat people to stage 4, when frankly it's harder to survive cancer. Same thing with addiction. We ought to be screening people early, look at the risk factors, trauma, look at their family histories of addiction and alcoholism. If we did that, we could build recovery supports and prevention and early intervention systems for people who have a high risk for succumbing to a predisposition to the disease of alcoholism and addiction, which, by the way, is highly genetic.
Yes.
So, basically, this parity law is, in a broader sense, not just about guaranteeing coverage, but it's about guaranteeing equity, which means, like, if in the midst of COVID, we raced to get a cure, a vaccine, why aren't we racing for a non-addictive analgesic for treatment of pain? And that's out there. But where is the urgency? Because we still know today a lot of people end up with an opioid addiction because of the initial prescribing of an opioid, which may be able to be prevented if we found an alternative to pain relief. All of which would be able to be possible if we were able to have the political urgency to do it, just like we did when we had COVID.
Absolutely. You mentioned where the urgency was, and immediately I thought stigma, I think.
Right.
And which kind of leads me into my next series of questions. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great read.
Thank you. Well, it's really a read about 12 of our fellows and their families.
Yes.
Because these diseases don't exist in isolation. And what often happens when we talk about our own stories is we leave out, a lot, either because we don't remember or we don't understand, have any insight, because frankly, the single characteristic of addiction and mental illness is lack of insight. That's why so many of us take it to the bitter end without changing, because we really aren't able to see ourselves and our disease as separate and understand that our disease is treatable if we accept and seek treatment. So in any event, I talk to all these people open up their medical records. They let me talk to family members who, by the way, they don't talk to anymore because they really were interested in getting the full picture. And so it's called The Profiles in Mental Health Courage. And at the back of the book, I have a QR code to a national strategy of policies that can begin to really change the way our system is designed so that we can more effectively treat addiction and prevent addiction and treat and prevent other mental illnesses. And unfortunately, just like we're trying to play catch up in this whole system that is anemic because we've never invested in it, we need to know what our agenda is so that we can begin to make up for lost time and end the discrimination against people who have these illnesses.
Absolutely. And I think that through line, like leading to those policy initiatives, the book makes the case, right? I think that there are these deeply, deeply personal stories that, for those of us in recovery, there may be different circumstances, but there are so many through lines that connect to each of us individually. I think of the emotions, and we see these gaps in care that you've outlined. Like, I think the gaps in care are outlined so clearly in the book.
But I want people to know I don't write a policy book. The policies are in the QR code. I think the stories, like every story, speaks to the gaps in the system. But I want people to know they're really just reading a story. I'm not preachy policy-wise, because that would be boring for most people.
Absolutely.
I want more people to read this than would read it just because it's a policy,
of course,
book. So
yeah, and so I just finished it last week, and I have to say that as someone in recovery myself, I found so many points of connection to these humans, even though they have vastly different stories. They come from really all walks of life. I think you've done a tremendous job choosing subjects who have little to no privilege to what seems like all the privilege one could be afforded.
totally.
So, other th- what drew you to this topic matter? How did you decide these are the folks I want to interview? How did you decide I want to hear these stories?
Well, I remember we just saw Simone Biles win another national championship. But I remember when she was in the last Olympics, she said she couldn't kind of get on the balance beam, so to speak, because her mental health. And people were giving her a hard time because they couldn't understand what does it mean
Mhm.
for her and what does it mean for anyone. We frankly have a lot of illiteracy in our country when it comes to understanding what is it like to actually live with these illnesses. How do we negotiate interpersonal relationships? How do we negotiate job and employment, family relationships? And how do we navigate care that is effective? So I wanted a more kind of realistic narrative because people today, yes, they're able to say they have a diagnosis, and that might be for some stigma ending, but it really hasn't ended until we can be more transparent about what it is really like with these illnesses and not feel the shame of the symptoms of these illnesses. And keep in mind, as we know, neither one of us wanted to wake up in any given day, lose the love and affection of our families, piss off all of our friends, jeopardize our employment, jeopardize our freedom and being arrested, and frankly, jeopardize our lives in overdosing. No one gets up in the morning and says, this is what I want to do.
Right.
So we still have this mistaken notion that somehow these are choices for people. And when people read these 12 stories, they'll be able to make the distinction, this is very important, between the great person and the horrific disease.
Yes.
And that doesn't happen from kind of sugarcoating their struggles. It happens from them really opening up and really showing people the nitty-gritty of what it's like living with these illnesses.
Absolutely. And that a large takeaway from my perspective was you did not shy away from some pretty severe symptoms. And you bridged a lot of different mental health diagnoses kind of under the umbrella of this book, which, by the way, the titular reference to Profiles in Courage is brilliant, if I could say so myself. It really elevates mental illness in a way that is destigmatizing, and it honors the people with mental illness by, having that reference.
Yeah,
point.
so my uncle, President John F. Kennedy, wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, and he featured 8 U.S. senators and courageous acts that they demonstrated in the way that they conducted themselves in national affairs. But 4 of those 8 had real experience with addiction and mental illness. Daniel Webster, the lead abolitionist in our country, died of cirrhosis of the liver. Sam Houston, first president of Texas and later U.S. senator, was castigated and shamed for being the big drunk. That's how he was called. Lucius Lamar, another senator, saw his father go out in front of the house and take a pistol to his head and take his life. John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams, both presidents, lost his 2 brothers to alcoholism in their 30s. He also lost his oldest son, George Washington Adams, to suicide at 28. I wanted to put that in context because obviously we think these issues are silent now. When my uncle was writing about it, I mean, no one would dare think to talk about anything, but these are an example that these are not new issues. We all know from the beginning of time they have been going on, but it's remarkable that we live in an age where we can finally address and tackle these illnesses that have cut so many people's lives short and meant that so many people have to live lives in quiet desperation and misery because now we have treatment, we have data that treatment can work if it's evidence-based and it's the right wraparound treatment. And now we have political advocacy that can help us put pressure on the system to ensure that that treatment is reimbursed.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's times have changed. Times they are a changing.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So what would you like to tell someone going into this book? What do you hope they keep in mind throughout reading these 12 stories?
Well, I have to say part of my strategy in putting the book out now, obviously during an election season, is to really socialize the idea that we have a campaign too. It's not a candidate, but it's a platform.
Yeah.
And our platform is 90, 90, 90 by 2033. 90% of Americans screened, 90% given evidence-based interventions, and 90% of the people supported in recovery. So that, frankly, was what the HIV/AIDS community adopted when they took on their fight, and why in mental health and addiction we should be any less aggressive is beyond me. Although, in our field, we're so used to being like that Bruce Springsteen, like a dog that's been kicked too much, that we aren't really aspirational. We feel so shitty about ourselves that we think, oh, we'll just take whatever we're given. We have to be fighting for those of our fellows who are dying, and we can't take this thing lightly. We have to be aggressive. We would never imagine, we're going to get 50% of the people with broken bones, treated, 50% of the people with cancer treated. But that's essentially what we're saying when we lower our sights for what's possible. So my point in the book is to get a conversation going, but also, to advance policy so we can help more people in their lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it seems like granted, I'm in this field, but just in the 10 years that I've been doing this recovery thing, the way that just your everyday people, again, this is totally anecdotal, but the way that your everyday people talk about recovery has changed. It seems to have changed. And I think that's the direct result of both policy initiatives and folks who we are currently at the Recovery Leadership Summit, folks who just have boots on the ground and all along the continuum of care are advocating for folks like me, like us.
Yes.
And I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Yes. Absolutely. We have, thanks to Mobilize Recovery and Faces and Voices of Recovery, and of course these other terrific organizations that are fighting to make sure more people get access to coverage, get access to the right coverage, get supported in recovery, having, employment supports, getting housing supports, getting sober housing reimbursed, getting the clubhouses reimbursed, the recovery community organizations paid for. These aren't necessarily medical, and so they don't often fall under insurance reimbursement, but what we need to advocate is for insurance companies to pay for these things, because these things improve outcomes better than often any pill could, and we have to be self-advocates to get this stuff done.
Of course. Absolutely. So going into this election year, I know that you are the founder of the Kennedy Forum, and you're working on this 90 and 90 and 90. What can our listeners do to help support their own mental health advocacy work?
Well, obviously, if they're part of Faces and Voices, if they're part of Mobilize Recovery, if they're part of their own recovery community organization, there's so much that's going on out there that they can be part of in their place of work, in their community. I obviously have been focused on insurance discrimination, and so I have, as part of our website, don'tdenyme.org. don'tdenyme.org. And I try to give people a little bit of a understanding of what their rights are so they can demand their rights, so they can go to their insurance commissioner if they want to be politically active, so they can go to their attorney general in their state with their fellows who have suffered denials of care that at least they think would not be the case if it were cancer or cardiovascular disease or diabetes, so forth. If they feel that, whether it's getting screened for treatment, whether it's getting paid, having the right medication-assisted treatment, whether it's getting all these other, then they can go to the Attorney General and say, look, this is a federal law. You must adhere to it. My insurance company doesn't follow it. Here are the examples. And by the way, they don't just apply to me, but they apply to these dozen other people. Now, if they can organize and get a dozen faces and voices in the waiting room of an attorney general or, frankly, an insurance commissioner, and these people don't get people like us in their waiting room. If they did, they would call up the insurance industry and say, what is going on here? Now, that's enough to maybe wake up the insurance company like, hey, fellas, we can't get away with this anymore. We better start changing. And even more, it may lend itself to a consent decree, which is when an attorney general negotiates with the payer to get them to adhere to do X, Y, and Z, like we've seen in many states in the country. So I would encourage people, we look at the civil rights movement. They had the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. They fought legally to change laws in different parts of the country. Why? Because they knew if they changed the practice and application of civil rights law in one state, it would have application to all states. We have to think the same way in this cause. If we fight and win in our local community, guess what? It sends a ripple of hope for other communities to say, look, they did it there. We can do it here. This is what they did. Let's do the same thing, and let's get a better system for our fellows. So we are all in it together. I don't care where people live in this country. We all depend on each other, not just because we're in recovery, but because we have a common fight that knows no geographical bounds. But unfortunately, geography often determines whether people get treatment or not. And we have to be fighting so that other areas of the country have a little bit easier time getting those same services because we were successful in getting them in our area.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as we start to approach time, I have a couple more questions for you. So the first one is, what's one thing that you wish someone told you entering recovery? In terms of advocacy, in terms of stigma, in terms of working in these fields?
Well, I have been very fortunate. Just first and foremost, I can't do any of this if I'm not sober. If I don't attend to my recovery, first and foremost, I can't have the 5 children, incredible wife and spouse and partner in recovery, if I didn't have a sponsor, a program, a peer support group, medication-assisted treatment, all of that. And I have to stay on it because, as we know, this insidiousness of this disease, it makes us feel like we don't have a disease. So if we get our way along, we think, oh, we got it licked. And I've relapsed over many, many, many years. I finally picked a permanent sobriety date. I've managed to stick to it, and I really make it my priority. And so that I would encourage first and foremost, because from that, now I can be a productive person. I'm able to help individuals just like me. I'm also able to do all this work that we've been discussing, which I never would have been able to do if I were still active in my addiction. So there's lots going on in this space. So I really think there's never been a time for people in recovery to feel more a part of the community and more meaningful to the cause, and for them to understand how valuable their own recovery is to help others. When anyone comes into a meeting and really can't really imagine themselves getting recovery and feeling full of regret and remorse, and I tell them there's someone out there just like you that when you get sober, you're going to be able to provide hope to that person because they're going to have the same story as you. So don't think about this as your recovery. Think about it as an opportunity for someone just like you in the future to get recovery because they're going to hear your story. So I love the spiritual nature of the work that we do. I believe strongly that we're all connected and we have the spark of divinity in each of us. So we have to honor that, just like we have to honor those who are living in the streets, in our jails and prisons, who don't get the help they need. We need to be their champion because there but for the grace of God goes every one of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Powerful words. So we end every episode of Recovery Stories Have Power with this question. Can you give our listeners one piece of advice? Anything.
Well, I think that being able to be of service takes me out of myself. And by nature, my disease is a disease of self-centeredness. And it's hard to break that thinking. And I know today that recovery means not just not drinking and drugging, but it also means doing things that are helpful to someone else, which is not my modus operandi. And yet I get relief from that pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization because I live in self-centered fear. If I'm thinking of someone else, it's like the best medicine there is. And so I encourage people to continue helping, not just in the sense of helping our fellows in peer support, but helping change the laws, change the regulations, change the pitiful amount of funding that comes into our space, given the public health epidemic and the number of lives that are being lost every year. It is a tragedy and a crime that we let this happen. And we need everybody listening to this to know their purpose is both personal with helping their fellows, but it's also policy. And if we are speaking up, we're going to help in kind of the spirit of 12th step, the broader public. Because keep in mind, founder of one of these 12-step groups, his first name was Bill, testified in Congress. Most people don't know that. And, we have lots of places to take our message of recovery to, and it's in a personal level, but it's also on a population level.
Absolutely. Well, Congressman, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to Recovery Stories Have Power. You can listen to all 2 seasons at facesandvoicesofrecovery.org/podcast. A big thank you to Mr. Kennedy for joining us on the podcast today. This does mark the end of our RLS Live video podcasts, but we have so much more content coming your way soon, so definitely stay tuned. Don't forget to like and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. We release new episodes twice a month, once in the middle, once at the end, always on a Thursday. Recovery Stories Have Power is produced and engineered by me, Oliver Books. Video, technical support, and website by Chris Aram. Opening and closing music is Come On Home by our friend Chris Tate, and a big shout out to the good folks at his RCO, Passenger Recovery. Comments and questions, please send us an email. We're at podcast@facesandvoicesofrecovery.org. Thanks so much for listening.